Tesla, Apple, Google, Facebook, every company inventing the future started somewhere with an idea and an investment. Where will tomorrow's futures be invented? Welcome to Future 39. I'm John Koetsier. Today we're speaking with former Apple executive and current venture capitalist Daniel Gross. Daniel says he wants to fund moonshot ideas from hackers, side hustlers, builders, and tinkerers all over the world. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, it's a real pleasure. Let's start. You're looking for problems in the world. Let's start here. What are the biggest problems that you're looking for that need solutions that you can address?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, the world I feel like is kind of full of problems, and certainly Pioneer, the company I work for, published quite a few on specific as well as broad problems. You know, everything from a bevy of enterprise software that's yearning to be built to launching better satellites into space. But for the most part, I'm actually fairly unprescriptive about the types of problems I found solving. I'm one person, exposed perhaps to the ideas of a few over the internet. But I actually think that the wisest decision one can have as kind of an investor and an asset allocator is to just be responsive to what people are building. And so, for the most part, I think the large takeaway is, despite the conversation around kind of great stagnation and the fact that there are no problems in the world, there are quite a few. And from kind of simple software that is maybe better customer support to launching microsatellites in space, there's plenty of improvement we can bring to the world, and much that should be better. That I think the kind of innovators of tomorrow will build.
So if you look at moonshots, though, specifically in terms of moonshots, when we think of moonshots, we think of big, hairy, challenging problems, big problems, maybe Great Garbage Patch in the Pacific, or maybe carbon emissions, or maybe homelessness, or whatever. If you think of moonshot things, what comes to mind for you specifically that you're looking at?
Well, the important thing to remember when we think about moonshots is, of course, one must marry kind of a great ambition, the secret realization that everything big really starts small. We could kind of think of the largest moonshot of our time that everyone looks to maybe being SpaceX. The company that not only create, the kind of satellite deployment of the future, but mesh networking that changes the world. Really started, if you kind of do a good job Googling around the internet, as I believe the Green Mars Oasis Project. That was the original title of it. And the goal of the company was to buy already existing rockets from the Russians, launch something into space, and try to just get a photo of a green plant on Mars, and then shut the company down. You can kind of think of it as a giant Hollywood stunt. And lo and behold, 12, 13 years later or so, it's the largest privately held space company on the planet, and may herald in kind of a new era of communication and kind of networking to the world. But again, it started out as a Hollywood stunt. And so we could kind of think of other kind of large problems, kind of geoengineering and carbon capture, being able to kind of get better at detecting and identifying mental health, the cost of housing. But it's important to marry that with the reality that, again, everything big, it's really small. And kind of the media narrative of these companies tends to overwrite that. Nothing to see here. Since the founder was 9 years old, they were thinking of the big grand thing, but that's often not the case. And so, you could find plenty of interviews with Mark Zuckerberg from 2005 saying, of course, Facebook shouldn't expand beyond just Harvard. Google was very much started as a university research project called Backrub. And so, we should think both of kind of grand ideas and the potential of small ideas. But I actually find it more interesting to get excited about the kind of simple things that have the potential to get big, as opposed to starting from the moonshots. Plenty of literature on the moonshots. You don't need me for that. The difficult thing that is hard to do is to breathe, and indeed to inject an element of optimism and faith into people that are starting with small, humble things. I believe one of the greatest causes of the kind of this great stagnation, or a decline perhaps in innovation, is a lot of great people who have the potential to build the next SpaceX, the next iPhone, not really even believing that their small, humble thing could get big. Self-editing is the largest disease of innovation. And it's kind of my goal to attempt to fix that. So, I think grand ambitions, grand ideas are great. Asimov has lectured us about that, though, since the 60s. I think the interesting question is, what's the small molecule you can get started with today that may fester and grow into a greater kind of plan?
I like that a lot, because if you're looking for the moonshot right now, the mountain's too high, the horizon's too far, the challenge is too big, the capital required is too much. But if you start with one thing that might grow, that's a pretty cool thing. If we think about big tech today, though, and we wonder what it looks like in the future. So today's big tech, obviously you've got Facebook and social and a bunch of other stuff, Google and search and many other things, including self-driving cars, Apple and devices, Amazon and retail, Microsoft and productivity, and all of them are doing a lot of other things as well. Where do you see the big companies and the big opportunities of the next maybe 10 years, 15 years? So a little farther out, when these small things that you're talking about have had a chance to grow, expand, and become something significant?
Well, I think we're going to see both. There's two ways of thinking about this. But before getting into it, I should say that it is notoriously difficult to predict the future. And
Yes, I'm aware.
it's quite startling to think, even if in 2009, if your job was to kind of predict the companies that would get big, I don't know that you would have predicted that Microsoft would actually be the largest tech giant, and the rise of Uber and Lyft. I think you'd be very focused on photo sharing apps, because that's what was big at the time. So I suspect, what becomes big, if we think 10 years, projecting 10 years forward, I can guarantee you only one thing: it'll look weird. A decade in technology is a long enough quanta of time to truly create an alternate universe. I was looking at the old ads Apple ran back in 2008 and 9, and it's fascinating to consider them given today's reality. They have an advertisement that goes something like, literally, I'm almost going to quote you verbatim. They're showing someone using the iPhone, and keep in mind, this is the original iPhone. It's small, fits in your hand, and they say, you love checking Facebook at home. Wouldn't it be great if you could check Facebook everywhere, all the time? And I'm not here to argue whether Facebook usage is good or bad for people, but I do think that they would have never run that ad in today's climate, right? And so, the ability to project forward a decade is, I think, almost impossible. However, there are some things I think we can flag. One is, I kind of think that the material will kind of be used to combust the great company of the future already exists in the wild today. So if you kind of think of 2009 to 2019, the thing that made stuff really big already existed in 2009, the mobile phone.
Sure.
So I actually think it'll be using kind of fundamentals we exist today, because it is possible that we will discover something great, say in 5 years from now, but things usually take a decade to go from discovery to kind of commoditization. And you watched really mobile go from total discovery to commoditization over 10 years. So it'll be something using kind of the building blocks that we have today, be it kind of CRISPR, genomics, more mobile, more enterprise, satellites, that type of thing. But it'll have kind of been lit on fire, so to speak. The other thing that I find quite exciting, just one final thought, sorry, is it's easy to look at incumbents today and think that they are unsurmountable. Indeed, there's a lot of conversation about, well, it was easy to take down IBM, Big Blue, but now the incumbents are much smarter. They're buying companies. I don't know. I think what happens is there's an ebb and flow to all markets, and companies are led by great people, and at some point those people either physically or kind of cognitively check out, and the product starts to atrophy. And I think a very distinct example where you can see this now is just the Amazon product search experience. Something that used to be wonderful today kind of requires a degree in investigative journalism to get through. You know, it really feels like it's unusable again. I don't know if you've tried buying like something as simple as a phone charger on Amazon. It really reminds you of the old internet with pop-ups. And so that's a great example of the kind of the cycles of innovation and a kind of great user experience. And then at some point, the free market imperative really demands that the product produces as much revenue as possible at the cost of long-term customer satisfaction. And just like kind of Windows get crummier to use over time, I kind of think all of the incumbents products will experience a similar thing. So
it's possible. You could also argue that Amazon is disrupting itself with perhaps Alexa or something like that, and you know, you could at some point assume you can do it today, obviously, but it would get better and better. You know, just simply ask Alexa to buy the thing that you want or whatever. So you could make that argument. And of course, you're absolutely right that the retail experience on Amazon is one that is not recommended for any other retail giant or retail startup to emulate. Absolutely. But if we look forward and we look at some of the things where maybe with small beginnings, but there might be some big companies, big ideas, big things in the future, we can see certain trends, right? We can see certain trends around carbon, capturing carbon out of the atmosphere. We can see some trends around recycling. We can see some trends around reduction of environmental harm. And actually, you know, as Microsoft did just yesterday, said we're actually gonna not just neutralize our environmental footprint. We're gonna reverse all the damage we've done in the past, right? So those are some things we see. We see things in terms of automation and AI coming in. We can imagine that future manufacturing processes will be even more automated year by year by year. Some thoughts in those areas?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think well, the first one you flagged earlier when discussing Amazon, I think is a great example of something that exists today that will kind of get commoditized to the future, which is voice interfaces. And I think, you know, the confluence of this and either virtual or augmented reality technology really feels like mobile felt maybe in 2007. So maybe it's slightly beyond the decade horizon where, yeah, it's out there. I mean, you can try Magic Leap and you can put it on and it feels uniquely important, but very early.
Yes.
You know, it's the type of thing where it feels like a prototype, but a very interesting one. And so I think that will be a general thing. You can kind of think of the overarching theme here of computing getting stitched into the real world, both in terms of the way we use it, which is a little bit less about a keyboard and a little bit more about talking,
Sure.
just the way we talk to people, and in vision. So that I think will be a large category. You know, and I think another unavoidable one is just, you know, different forms of first and second order derivative changes due to self-driving trucks and cars.
Sure.
I actually think this will affect the world at kind of the infrastructure layer before the consumer layer. So automated trucking, I think will completely, you know, change the paradigm for what you can ship. And of course, the second order effect of all of these things are much more interesting to me than the first. You know, if shipping is totally free, what can you do that you cannot do today? You know, I think satellites in general, the near free cost of launch of satellites, and the, you know, kind of giant reduction of payload cost will again result in a lot of, we can think of it as non-consumption. If you can send things to space for free, what happens? You know, does space decluttering?
You end up with 1 million people on Mars, perhaps.
Yeah, and it has become very important to kind of declutter the orbit around Earth, which,
Yes.
you know, is increasingly getting filled with more and more satellites. If every person on the planet had a satellite, what would they do with it? You know, it's an interesting one to ponder. I think there's a lot of different areas, but I should also flag there's a lot of obvious stuff just with the existing bread and butter of enterprise that I think will be built. You know, Accenture and Deloitte are examples of companies that today produce ungodly amounts of revenue building software. I believe Deloitte did $43 billion of revenue last year, and something like 15. By the way, that's not the valuation, that is revenue.
Yes.
So that is like SpaceX's valuation in revenue. And I believe a giant chunk of that is software, and a lot of that I think will continue to be unbundled into different startups. And while I realize while not kind of techno utopian and exciting to think of as settling the frontier of a new planet, I do think it's an exciting and important area, because let's not forget that software is what powers, it is the bedrock that powers kind of consumer world. So if
Yes.
you have better software for airlines, that means like your flights get canceled less.
And they fall out of the sky less as well, as Boeing learns.
Well, yeah, that's a deeper, interesting issue as well. So there's a lot. And I think, again, the important reminder is, if someone's watching this, it's one thing if I don't know, Elon's watching this from the comfort of the Tesla Gigafactory, but it's a whole other thing if you're just getting started and you're not quite sure what company to start. There's no need, I think, to get started with a grand vision. The interesting thing is to try to kind of slice off an area of the market that no one else is really focusing on, and build something useful fairly quickly, fairly lightweight, which will feel small and it'll compound.
Let's talk about that, and let's go into more depth on that then, in terms of democratizing innovation, and doing that in a couple
Yes.
ways, right? First, in terms of capital and the amount of capital required, right? Where VCs have sort of traditionally held kind of the keychain or the keys to scaling innovation, right? But also in terms of and something that you've worked on is geography. And if you're not in the right place in the world, aka Silicon Valley, you can't really build the startup that you want. So talk a little bit about democratizing innovation, in terms of who can do it, how they do it in terms of capital, and where they can be.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of. Well, one of the things I think a lot about is, we know as a fact that there is something here in Silicon Valley and in these zip codes that creates kind of a Cambrian explosion of innovation. We know that when people come here, like, again, we can kind of view this with fairly rough tools, we're kind of surgeons looking at it at a fairly high level. We know that, I'm not quite sure why, but we know that this thing produces great companies. And one of the things I'm very interested in is dissecting all of the properties that lead to that lead to the place that is kind of the technological frontier that generates things like GitHub and Microsoft and Uber and SpaceX, and unbundling that and really trying to give people as much of that Californian optimism as possible through the internet. So what do you have going on here? One thing you obviously have is capital, and so that's a fairly simple one. So one thing I do, Pioneer does, is try to find promising people around the world and fund them without them necessarily having to move here. Okay, so that's one. The other is culture. So what does that mean? And obviously a lot of crazy, an infinite list of things indeed. But one proper one is just density of other people that you're surrounded by that cause you to kind of punch above your weight. I remember when I came out to California, I had just turned 18, and one of the greatest things that ever happened to me is I met Mark Zuckerberg. And I realized in meeting him that he was human. And that sounds weird, but you got to realize I grew up reading TechCrunch,
Sure.
reading about Facebook, the coolest company at the time, and you meet this person, you realize, oh, like, okay, so like you are just a human. I am a human too. I can kind of do that. And so the question is, how do you recreate that effect on the internet? That is something I think that has only recently become possible, and something that Pioneer tries to do. We put people together in a physical space on the web, and through video conferencing, podcasts, we can really create a sense of place, almost like a city. It is obviously not as good as the real city, and indeed Pioneer actually also flies people out to California to give them kind of a real world dose of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that this is a very important thing right now. The fact that Zoom really made durable video conferencing cheap and scalable is a really big deal. Zoom is quite different from Hangouts. It's quite different from Skype. It really works, and it works at scale. We have some of these meetings here at Pioneer where we have dozens of people, all kind of attending and talking to each other, a meeting. And you couldn't really have that even 5, 6 years ago. And that is an attempt to recreate kind of the culture and the community of Silicon Valley. Another thing Silicon Valley, I think, provides is mentorship. You can meet people here that are kind of further ahead from you in the game. And because someone took the time, the daylight, to help them, they will help you. And we try to scale this effect up quite a bit by getting people mentored by different folks from industry, founders of companies that are already successful. And it's quite interesting that people do this just to pay it forward. There's almost no economic incentive here. And I spend a lot of time working with founders, often with no economic incentive, just because the same was done to me. So the hope is to try to reverse engineer some of the properties of what makes, these 5, 6 zip codes really good, and bring that onto the internet, create a city of a kind of a digital city of innovative youngsters, hopefully building the future. And I think it'll be harder than doing it in the real world. There's something going on now that we're experiencing as we're talking over video that's assuredly better than a phone call, but assuredly inferior to being in the real world.
Yes.
And so we do have a little bit of a headwind in front of us, but I do think that if we're smart with how we architect it, and we really built kind of good product and good experiences around it, with a confluence of things like Zoom and Slack and forums and email, we can kind of get there.
It's interesting. One company that I worked with for some time had a TV set up, and I'm not sure what technology they used. I don't think it was Zoom. I don't think it was a Hangout. It was some kind of technology, video conferencing technology. And they would just place a large screen TV in the office that would connect to a similar large screen TV in another office or somebody's home office or whatever. And it was always on. The video conference was always on. And the point was not that, you could just see what they were doing in Seattle or see what they were doing in San Francisco or whatever. The point was, because you couldn't hear, beyond some distance where the mic was and everything, but you could go and you could walk up to that screen and you could say, hey, Fred, what's going on with this? It was analogous to being in the same office. It wasn't the same as you're talking about, but it was an attempt to kind of replicate that always on presence in some sense.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and is, I think, a very under-researched area for us that's very important, because if we're able to build something that's 80% as good as being together in the real world, that's quite a big deal for immigration purposes and for creating kind of a borderless world.
Let's end here. Let's talk about the future of the company. The company has evolved quite some over the past few decades, from a thing that always had to be in one place to what we're talking about, which it can be in many places at many times, to where, we don't actually need an office everywhere. Somewhere we do, somewhere we don't. That sort of thing. Do you see further evolution of that? I mean, we've seen some people talking about that, about companies being more kind of ad hoc over time, almost like a production company that makes a movie that comes together for a project and disbands. That might seem to be too transitory for a company. I'm not sure. But how do you see that evolving?
I'm torn, I'm torn because on the one hand, I do think there's some very interesting things that will happen that will be outliers in terms of outlier models of very weird companies. Like, I'll give you one example. I do think in this decade, we will see companies that are led by identities that are pseudonyms as opposed to real identities. So you can imagine a fully distributed company on the internet, and you don't even really know who the CEO is. They have a Twitter handle, maybe, with a fake avatar. They're very present, but you don't know their real identity. I think we will probably see a few of those, which is very interesting, very foreign, very sci-fi. But I also think that for the most part, the organizational structure that we've been using, pre-industrial revolution, even for militaries, will continue to be the bread and butter that most companies subscribe to. And I say this and I say this, and I actually intend to include even remote in this. I do think there are things on the fringe like Pioneer that will work in a fully distributed fashion. But like I mentioned before, until we have full blown presence, AR, VR, magic, which I do think is 5, 6, 7 years away, those are headwinds. And so I believe it is still the case that it is efficacious and probably the kind of the correct, simplest, laziest action one could take would be to start a company and have hierarchy and have dedication from their employees, have loyalty, be in a physical place together. All of that being said, one very practical change that I think will happen is, as a byproduct of Bay Area housing, costs really skyrocketing to infinity, and bad regulation on California's part, it's quite possible that San Francisco is not the hotbed it was, it is right now, say in 2025, 2029. And let's not forget, by the way, in 2008, 2009, it wasn't even San Francisco, it was Palo Alto, about an hour south of here, that was the hotbed. And prior to that, it was even deeper in kind of Santa Clara. If you think about where DEC and all the semiconductors are. So I think the hubs will shift over time, but I definitely do believe that for the most part, the kind of meat and potatoes of the industry will still be kind of hierarchical models that just seem to work really well for humans to just organize and get things done. And we'll probably see
know who to talk to.
Yeah, you know who to talk to. You have clarity. You have goals. You have mission. You see people. You come into the office. That style of thing. A lot of benefits. The Homo sapien has been doing this thing for 2 million years, right? So, I think on the fringe we'll see some weird stuff, right? We might find ourselves, maybe there's a game studio that's led by an anonymous identity, or 1 or 2 companies that's fully distributed, that style of thing.
Yes,
but for the most part,
plan of companies or something like that, or a smart contract that governs the operation of an economic entity that people come into and leave. And yeah, there are some possibilities there, but I think there's a lot of challenges as well.
One mental model for us is this: the act of kind of finding and honing product market discovery requires a lot of effort, actually, and occasionally it is struck fairly early, like a prospector finding oil by putting a toothpick in the sand and having the dark material gush out, and fairly accidentally. And if that is the case, then the company can afford to be remote, distributed, weird, headless, whatever you want, egalitarian. I suspect it's successful in spite of that, not because of that. Everyone else in the world, the act of refining product market fit requires effort, requires prospecting from oil site to oil site. And that is best done in kind of the traditional way we've been doing things forever, in my opinion. May happen in a different geo, may happen more in London than San Francisco, but it'll still be companies as we know them today.
Excellent. Well, cool. Thanks so much for joining us on Future 39. For anybody who's listening now or in the future, whatever platform you're on, please like, subscribe, share, or comment. And if you're on the podcast and you like this, please rate it and review it. Thanks again for spending some time with us. And until next time, this is John Koetsier with Future 39.
Thanks for having me.